I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as President Trump prompts further outrage with his claim NATO troops avoided the front line in Afghanistan, we consider whether President Zelensky was right to call out Europe in his speech at Davos, and ponder whether the Greenland saga can now be put to bed, or if it was truly indicative of a historic shift. Then we return to the topic of resilience with the second half of our interview with former British Army officer Ash Alexander-Cooper.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 23rd of January, 3 years and 335 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined live in the studio by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls. Over to him for the latest in the military realm.
Well, hi Francis. Sorry if you can't hear me that well. I'm a little bit back from the microphone.
A little bit back being where we Brits like to be, apparently. Just a few words there, responding to Donald Trump's stupid comments on Fox News last night about NATO troops being in Afghanistan, but just a little bit back from the front lines. That, you'll remember, Francis, that's the Afghanistan where 457 British soldiers were killed, including some mates of mine. And it's the same Afghanistan that saw most soldiers killed per capita coming from Denmark. Yes, that Denmark. Anyway, I will respond to Trump's ignorant comments about the profession of arms, something he demonstrably but tragically knows nothing about, later in Final Thoughts. But for now, let's go to Kyiv, where about 25% of the city's housing supply remains without heating after the recent Russian attacks. This comes from Mayor Vitaly Klitschko, who was speaking yesterday. Now, that is 2,600 residential buildings. Some homes have been without heating and power since the first big strike of the year on January the 9th, a situation made worse by the second mass aerial attack on Tuesday of this week. Now, most of the buildings are in eastern Kyiv on the left bank of the Dnipro River. Mayor Klitschko was speaking yesterday around the same time that Energy Minister Denis Shmyhal was describing Thursday as the most difficult day for the energy system since the blackout in November 2022. Mr. Shmyhal was speaking in the Ukrainian language, not the Ukrainian dialect, a phrase I mistakenly used a couple of days ago when describing the difference between the pronunciation of Chernobyl and Chornobyl in relation to Russian attacks on the nuclear power plant. A silly error for which I apologise. So Mr. Shmyhal said yesterday, the situation is extremely serious. The most difficult situation is in Kyiv, Kyiv Oblast and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Now, at least 19 people, including 5 children, were injured in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast yesterday. Local authorities said the cities of Dnipro and Kryvyi Rih particularly targeted yesterday afternoon. A strike on a 2-storey residential building in Kryvyi Rih accounted for most of those casualties. Across the country as a whole, Russia launched 101 drones into Ukraine overnight. The Air Force said this morning 19 got through air defence. Most of the deaths were in Donetsk Oblast, but Zaporizhia, Kherson and Kharkiv were also hit. Now, speaking of air defence, and a unit of the Territorial Defence Force of Ukraine that's defending a large portion of the capital's airspace will soon be receiving direct support from expat residents who also live in the city. Permission has just been given for non-native Ukrainians to volunteer in what will be Ukraine's first international air defence reserve unit. Once fully trained, they'll be operating alongside Ukrainians who also live and work around Kyiv. Aside from the direct impact this will hopefully have on Russia's drone attacks on residential areas, the intent is to focus the attention of friends, colleagues and others back in their home nations in order to encourage greater support and increased flows of aid for Ukraine. Now, we've been tracking the genesis of this project, and we hope to visit our friends setting it up the next time we're in Kyiv. Now then, another Russian oil depot has gone up in flames, having had drone debris land on it. This is the oil depot in the Russian city of Penza, about 500 kilometres southeast of Moscow. We're being asked to believe that Russian air defence worked perfectly and shot the drone down, so they're not to blame at all, but then the pesky drone debris did all the damage. So Penza Oblast Governor Oleg Melchenko said the debris of a downed drone fell onto the territory of the oil depot, causing a fire. Emergency services are currently working at the scene. Now, that was part of a wider series of Ukrainian drone strikes against Russian oil and weapons facilities, the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces said this morning. Targets included Russia's Tamaneftegaz oil terminal on the Kerch Peninsula, so just south of the Kerch Bridge, along with several radar stations in Russian-occupied Crimea, a drone storage facility in the occupied part of Kherson Oblast, and a Russian command and observation post in Donetsk Oblast, officials said. A source in the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, told the Kyiv Independent that it was their drones, operated by the SBU's Alpha Special Operations Unit, that had hit the Tamaneftegaz oil terminal. The strike damaged technological pipelines, the terminal's berths, and multiple oil storage tanks, according to the source. Damage to shut-off valves caused petroleum products to leak and then ignite, the individual said, adding that the fire in total was about 7,000 square metres. Now, Rob Lee, referred to him occasionally, a senior fellow at the US-based Foreign Policy Research Institute, a great one for open source intelligence. He says that a Moscow military court has sentenced a Ukrainian commander to life in prison in absentia for the 2022 sinking of the Black Sea Fleet's flagship, the Moskva. In doing so, the court's official press release, which was later deleted, admitted for the first time that the Moskva was destroyed by a missile strike. So, the court's press release, which said the Moskva, the flagship, and the frigate Admiral Essen were performing humanitarian missions in neutral waters of the Black Sea to ensure the safety of civilian shipping. Of course they were. The press release said, on April 13th, 2022, a missile strike using 2 missiles was carried out against the Guards missile cruiser Moskva, as a result of whose explosions a fire broke out in the vessel, accompanied by smoke filling the internal compartments. As a consequence of the explosions and fire and smoke inhalation, 20 members of the cruiser's crew died, 24 crew members sustained bodily injuries of varying severity, and 8 persons went missing, including during efforts to preserve the ship's survival, which lasted more than 6 hours. Now, connected to that, I know President Zelensky at Davos last night responded to Donald Trump's concerns about Russian warships swarming all around Greenland. President Zelensky said, if Russian warships are sailing freely around Greenland, Ukraine can help. We have the expertise and weapons to ensure not one of those ships remains. They can sink near Greenland just as they do near Crimea. No problem. We have the tools and people. If we were asked, and if Ukraine were in NATO, but we are not, we would solve this problem with the Russian ships. Now, still on the high seas, and France, with a little help from Britain, has seized a sanctioned Russian oil tanker in the Mediterranean. The operation was led by the French Navy, which deployed troops from 2 military helicopters to raid the vessel. French authorities said the mission had been conducted in cooperation with our allies, including the UK. Now, the tanker, which has been sanctioned by the UK, US and the EU, was travelling from Murmansk, the Russian port of Murmansk, loaded with Russian oil. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, later wrote in a post about the interception, "We are determined," I'll do it in my voice, not that silly accent that Donald Trump put on the other day, "We are determined to uphold international law and to ensure the effective enforcement of sanctions." And then Britain's Defence Secretary John Healey said last night, "Deterring, disrupting and degrading the Russian shadow fleet is a priority for this government. I can confirm that the UK has provided tracking and monitoring in support of the French operation to board the tanker Grinch." This support included HMS Dagger. She's a Type 45 destroyer. The support included HMS Dagger monitoring the vessel through the Straits of Gibraltar. Alongside our allies, we are stepping up our response to shadow vessels to choke off the funds that fuel Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And then just finally for me, Francis, earlier this week I mentioned a fundraising effort in Poland to help provide generators and other support for Ukraine through these winter months in the wake of all the strikes there. Well, a new friend in Poland told me this morning that today over 5 million zlotys, about 1.2 million euro, has been donated. That's over 4 times, I think, their original aim. And also today a truck, and he sent me some photos of this, a truck's leaving Kyiv full of small petrol generators for individual use, as well as 2 bigger diesel generators. These have all been funded by the Polish Stand With Ukraine Fund. So interesting stuff that, and please do keep us in touch. If you see these things, when they get there, let us know how they get on. That's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Perhaps you can help at home. I spent this morning rifling through my rather tatty copy of Aesop's Fables, trying to find the one story, and I think it involves a lion, which shows it's better to speak the truth, even when it's inconvenient, than to try and live a lie in the hope of surviving just a little bit longer, but ultimately getting gobbled up regardless. That is the view of those defending President Zelensky's punchy remarks yesterday at Davos, where he, of course, criticised Europe's indecisiveness and inability to act boldly, as Dom reported on Thursday. For many, he was simply saying it as it is. For others, it was unpragmatic in the extreme, biting the hand that feeds him. Something I'm sure Aesop also wrote a fable about. Now, his critics point to the fact that 3 days ago, the European Parliament formally approved that 90 billion support loan for Ukraine, and the EU defence spending budget was also up 11% in 2025. His defenders say that Europe needs to be jolted into action, especially given Trump's threats this week over Greenland. A senior aide to Zelensky told the Financial Times that every time we try to do something in partnership with Europe, they are reluctant to act boldly as a unified force. Instead, they look to the US for a positive signal of how to act. It's strange, the official said. Europe is a great power, but it needs the courage to admit it. At the emergency summit of European leaders in Brussels yesterday, Politico reports how, despite Trump's apparent climb down on Greenland, and more on that in a moment, the atmosphere was one of there's no turning back. They discussed the quiet realisation that Europe's post-1945 Rubicon has been crossed, with French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz united in warning that the transatlantic crisis has catapulted the bloc into a harsh new reality, one which has to embrace independence. We have to work as an independent Europe. Those are the words of European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, speaking to reporters after that 5-hour gathering. She also announced in very clear signalling that the EU has decided to begin procuring weapons and equipment suitable for combat operations in Arctic conditions. Now, many will be sceptical that Europe really has woken up. Maybe it will just quickly revert back to its muscle memory once this crisis has faded. But is it fading? The Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, released a statement last night where she said that there's been no change whatsoever with regards to their sovereignty. She also didn't say whether that rumoured offer to Trump of the so-called Cyprus option, where British bases there are deemed UK territory, serving as a template for US bases in Greenland, has been agreed. So is the matter settled, or is this actually going to rear its head again? Now, speaking of Cyprus, as subscribers to our weekly newsletter will know, I've been asking myself whether, if Trump were to move against Greenland, there are historical precedents for one member of a voluntary alliance attacking another without the alliance itself collapsing. To be clear, not an empire, but a consensual association of sovereign states. I ask that because I'm increasingly convinced that if the worst had or does occur, European leaders would strain every diplomatic sinew to keep the US inside the tent of NATO, even if that meant sacrificing Greenland. The answer, it turns out, is there are fewer historical precedents than one might expect. In the end, I could only really find a single conflict, the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974. Greece and Turkey had both joined NATO in 1952, yet in the mid-70s, Turkey invaded Cyprus following a Greek-backed coup aimed at union with Greece. The Turkish forces fought against Greek Cypriots and, indirectly, Greek interests. So you just about have two NATO members on opposing sides of an armed conflict. It just about meets the criteria. Two sovereign members of the same alliance effectively at war. Now, what followed there is interesting. The conflict was framed as regional rather than ideological. The US and its allies pressed for de-escalation, not expulsions. No one seriously contemplated removing Greece or Turkey from NATO. Cyprus was partitioned and the alliance endured. Now, suffice to say, Greece and Turkey, for all their importance, were not NATO's central pillars. The US is the alliance's indispensable core. Could NATO survive the US attacking a sovereign member? Could it withstand an American withdrawal triggered by such a crisis? It seems doubtful to me, but it is interesting that Cyprus was clearly also on the minds of European leaders behind closed doors amid this crisis. And are they now suddenly supposed to forget about Trump's threat that because he hadn't won the Nobel Prize, he might one day seize an ally's territory? It's also worth remembering that Trump's new Board of Peace is essentially an attempt to circumvent NATO and the UN to try and broker deals outside of the usual legal frameworks, and almost certainly in a way that would profit the US. A White House official confirmed to the Kyiv Independent that the board could play a role in trying to settle the war in Ukraine. That should trouble Europe, given Hungary and Russia have both signed up. In an ingenious, if predictable, offer to please Trump, while also undermining attempts by some of Ukraine's allies to seize the billions of frozen Russian state assets, Putin said he would pay $1 billion to be on the board, as long as it came from those same frozen assets in Europe, which of course he doesn't have control over, and which would require Washington putting pressure on the Europeans to release. Now, when a reporter asked Trump yesterday whether he was inclined to let Putin do that, the president said, "I don't know. Who said that? Yeah, it's fine. He's using his money." Now, in the exchange, it's not entirely clear whether Trump knew what the reporter meant when they asked him about the frozen assets. But if he does, then that is a gloomy omen. The dominance of the US over the peace talks in Europe's absence is the core reason behind Ukraine, Russia and the US holding three-way talks in Abu Dhabi later. The first time the three countries have sat down together since the invasion. It was confirmed in the early hours of this morning after talks at the Kremlin between Putin, US envoy Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner. The full details of the conversations in the UAE haven't been released, and it's not clear even whether Russian and Ukrainian officials will meet face-to-face. We just know that the talks will last 2 days. But it's very hard to be optimistic about any breakthrough for all of the reasons we've talked about in recent weeks, although Witkoff claims there's only a single issue remaining. We shall see. But to end where we began, Zelensky spoke frankly yesterday, and yet is being pragmatic today. What can appear prudent in one moment can appear reckless the next. There are no easy answers, and I think his speech and the reaction to it captures that tension neatly. Maybe that's the only lesson we can take from all this for now. But before we go to our interview, I think it's probably worth us reflecting on the past week or so in relation to Greenland, because this does feel like a historic moment. Has it been diffused now, Dom, or do we need to be still thinking about this and its ramifications? Is this over, or should we just put it to bed?
I think there does need to be a serious reckoning. I think that is already happening. The fact that the meeting last night in the EU was 5 hours, when they decided at the end of it to buy some mittens or what have you. I think a lot more happened is what I'm saying. So I think they've decided, you know what, the United States is not what we hoped it was going to be. We need to sit this one out. We need to make some preparations. Hopefully they'll come back in the next few years. But for right now, we need to think about number one. You remember that love letter I wrote to the United States 3 or 4 months ago now, when I basically said, I've always loved the United States, served alongside you. I was with you on 9/11 on operations in Europe, served alongside you in Iraq, Afghanistan, love the United States. But right now, I don't think I like you very much. Not all of you, of course, many, many friends, but writ large. And I think Europe might have come round to a similar, slightly less bombastic way of expressing that view. Greenland is serious, not only because of the bluff. Now, I mean, if this is the art of the deal, that you shout and scream and lie down and kick your heels and thump your fists on the floor and then you back down, why on earth should anybody believe you next time? Is this how it's done? Is this the art of the deal, that you get something and claim it as a massive win, having talked in terms of the alliance ending, or talked in terms that would end the alliance? So next time, is it bluffing? I don't know. But you might think that Europe is irrelevant, and you know my views on Europe. But think about what's happening in the head of Putin and Xi Jinping and others like that. When Trump says, I'm going to do this, I'm going to, you do that, you keep spinning those centrifuges, I'm going to come and do this. They're just more likely now to think, I reckon we can tough this one out. I don't think he's serious. He's not up for it. So what he's done is to undermine the idea of NATO and the idea of US security, apart from all the other stuff that we mentioned about. If you think Russia is such a threat that you need to take Greenland to protect against the ships and submarines and God knows what else you're talking about, then if Russia is that big a threat, then tell your man Witkoff to get the hell out of the office. Don't go shake hands with the leader of that country.
And don't invite him to your border peace.
Well, exactly. It's also incoherent. It's the snow dome being shaken, and I'm not saying it doesn't need being shaken in certain areas, but we just don't know which areas are real anymore. We don't know what's lasting. And just as much as Russia loves chaos and try and create chaos, they don't want you to believe something. They just want you to not believe anything. And they'll put forward all these different theories of call it what you like, the Salisbury nerve agent poisoning or the reasons for invading Ukraine or what have you. They'll come up with all sorts of theories such that you can quite easily say, well, hang on, that's not correct. You're saying three different things. They don't care. They don't want you to believe one thing. They want you to not believe anything. And I think Trump's heading towards that area, that really dangerous cognitive area, because we just don't know whether he's telling the truth, whether he believes it himself, whether he understands it, let alone if they're actually going to see it through. So I think Greenland, I couldn't ever see it coming down to armed action. And we were asked in today's newsletter, we were asked a question about would US forces view it as an illegal order if they were asked to go and take Greenland by force. Plot spoiler, if you get the newsletter, I said no, I don't think it would be, because under US law, it would be for that kind of decision, it would be underpinned with enough legal guarantees to say no, it's totally legal. But that doesn't mean that it's still a good idea or that it doesn't do fundamental damage. And so even though it didn't happen that way, and we don't know in what way something has happened, I think there is a fundamental shift here that people are just looking at Donald Trump thinking, you know what, he doesn't even know what he's going to say tomorrow, so why the hell should we try and take it at all face value? We now just need to retrench and rebuild, which we're all for. But the way he's going about it is extraordinary, and I don't mean that in a good way. I mean that in the sort of literal sense. It is not the ordinary, and I think it's doing more damage for the good that it is doing in certain areas. It's doing more damage overall.
I mean, to borrow from another Aesop's fable, it's the boy who cried wolf, isn't it? And at what point are we collectively supposed to believe that a threat is real? And I think to your point, Dom, what concerns me is that amid all of this bluster, amid the boy constantly crying wolf, another country, whether it be China, whether it be Russia, perhaps makes a calculation thinking, well, he's not serious this time, or perhaps even it would be a European country in a different context. And yet, actually, that time he is serious. And it leads to a very major escalation, miscalculation. This is what history shows us time and time again can happen, particularly when you're dealing with autocrats like Putin, like Xi. I know the argument that there is power in this uncertainty, and I do also acknowledge that there is some truth to that. But amid chaos can also be chaos, and that can be the ultimate outcome of these events. So with you, I think this is very, very serious, and I do think that we need to not just bury what's happened over the last fortnight or so and remember it and learn some important lessons from it.
Yeah, I think we should. And that needs to happen fast, because to give a tangible example, would Xi Jinping right now think, you know what, this is chaos. Chaos isn't always good, but if I want to have a go at Taiwan, chaos isn't bad. And what comes after Trump is it might not be in many ways what went before, but it's not going to be as chaotic and as hectic. I'm best off having a go at Taiwan now.
Exactly. Rather
than leave it a few years just to see if the US establishment settles down to a continued Trumpian mood, but the individuals don't seem to be around that can keep the pace, this flooding the zone of international news and chaos. So I think that his actions and his words are bringing on the very threat that most seizes his mind right now, which is China.
Yeah, and I think that we should reflect on the fact that the latest intelligence briefings, some of them leaked a few months ago, suggest that China is serious about the prospect of potentially trying to seize Taiwan by force in 2027. We're not far away. This is next year. And we're only weeks into 2026. Who knows how many other incidents we're going to see like this that damage the international community, however we describe it, or the Western Alliance, NATO, Article 5. We're a year in to Trump's second presidency. And you can imagine leaders calculating that we may never get better than this in terms of a situation to strike at territory. And if you reflect on the 30s and even you could say the 1910s, similar calculations were being made in European capitals. And we all know where that ended. That deciding where the greater risk is to do a preemptive move or not. So I think it's very, very serious. Very, very serious. And it's right for us to take stock of it, really. And now for the second part of Dom's interview with fellow Army veteran Ash Alexander-Cooper. Along with Dr. Jessica Miller, a specialist in neuropsychology, Ash has written a book called Mindful Soldier, Building Resilience to Overcome Life's Challenges. In yesterday's podcast, they focused on the individual. Today, their discussion looks at how groups, such as the community that listen to this podcast, can connect even when spread thousands of miles from each other. We rejoin their conversation as Ash is falling asleep under anaesthetic prior to having a bullet removed from his leg, only to notice to his horror that the medic has marked up the wrong leg. Here's their conversation.
In the first segment, we focused on the individual and the steps we can all take to build our personal resilience. In this second part of our discussion, we're going to lift these ideas to the level of a community to explore how we can still feel connected, even when we are spread geographically far from areas of support. We're going to look at the role of compassion in stress management, even if thousands of miles away from each other, how we can contribute to the strength of that community, which in itself can be a win-win scenario. Now, Ash, at the end of part one, we left you on a hospital bed about to have a bullet removed that had remained lodged in your leg after an operation, as in a military operation. But as the anaesthetic kicked in, you noticed the medic had drawn an arrow on your leg pointing to the wrong place to start digging. You tried to point this out to the team, but passed out before anyone could understand what on earth you were talking about. So what happened next?
Yeah, so if any of you have ever had general anaesthetic, you'll know they count you down from 10 or up to 10. I think I was out only a few numbers in, having observed not only the wrong place.
Just as well, you're an infanteer.
Yeah, touché. But it was the arrow was on the wrong leg, even though it should have been fairly obvious because there was a big hole where the bullet had gone in. Anyway, thankfully I woke up and found the wrong arrow was crossed out. The new arrow was correctly positioned and the stitches appeared to be in the right place. So that was removed. So thankfully, there was some harm done and I can't feel some of my leg and what have you. But yeah, that was a relief, to say the least.
Well, as listeners to part one will now know, it clearly didn't have a long-term impact because you then went and did a marathon in your hotel room in quarantine.
Very slowly.
Over COVID. I was just on that. That must have put such stress on your ankles and knees, the turning all the time.
That wasn't ideal. Luckily, it was a fairly old building that had been converted into a fancy hotel. And thank God it was a fancy hotel, not a hideous one. But the floors were concrete, so nobody complained as far as I know. The hotel staff were aware and bless them, they gave me an extra meal because they knew the food was so awful during those COVID quarantine sessions, so I had a little bit of pasta and a Lucozade. But yeah, the turns, it was actually okay on the ankles. I think I did strap them actually in the end, but the carpet was a bit messed up at each end, so I was worried about getting charged for a new carpet. It didn't need a new carpet, but I did take all the fluff that I generated and took it with me when I was finally released.
Okay, now I'd like to talk about compassion as a tool for stress management. In the book, you say the brutal reality is that the human brain is physically unable to feel fear and compassion at the same time. You cite work by Miller in 2022. The result of this is that compassion can become a powerful weapon for stress management. Interesting use of the word weapon, I thought. Now, when we learn to activate low levels of compassion, you say we can immediately quieten our nervous system and once again stimulate the smartest part of our brains, the prefrontal cortex, to be able to make good decisions. This is called smart compassion. Now, is it called smart compassion as it's more of a conscious decision to act in that way? I've not heard the expression smart compassion before.
Yeah, this is a technique where you consciously just give yourself a bit of a break. That we're all very hard on ourselves most of the time. It's widely said we're our own worst critics, and that genuinely is the case. So just recognising where being a little bit kinder to ourselves and having a bit, going back to that other technique we mentioned about being grounded, just that moment of pause to have a breath and just feel yourself rooted to the spot in that moment can make all the difference for how you then approach the next phase if this thing is ongoing. So just being kinder to ourselves and applying compassion where appropriate. It doesn't have to last for the entire thing. You need to be able to do things immediately thereafter, but it's a really important technique to be able to draw on if you need it.
Now, one part that really made me sit back and reread it time and time again, think long and hard. So Dr. Jessica Miller, your colleague on the book, a specialist in neuropsychology, she said low levels of compassion could be feeling slight, brackets, and ever so slightly smug, pity for someone whose behaviour is atrocious, by acknowledging that although we must deal with their attitude right now, they have to wake up each day and look in the mirror and see that potential for monumentally messing up staring right back at them. Now, she does then say a less judgmental approach is to take a moment to consider all the influences on that person's life, how they learn about the world and their current circumstances that pushes them perhaps even unwillingly towards this mentality. Now, I was surprised by that. It feels, I mean, she says ever so slightly smug. So when I'm annoyed by cyclists running red lights, cycling on the pavement, I should consciously try to feel a little bit smug that I'm not the asshole on the bike.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you could also switch out the word smug for just feeling that you own the moral high ground, that you are better than that person or that situation, whether it's a boss screaming and shouting at you or a colleague and you think that's just so inappropriate that you want to kind of either protect them or defend them and get a bit angry and antsy about it. And you may still want to do that, but actually just recognizing that perhaps there might be stresses or strains in their life and they're just less better able to cope with those stresses and strains than you. And those are therefore opportunities where you might be able to help someone else by giving them some tips and techniques rather than our immediate response. If you've got that sort of fight or flight, you want to fight and just get really angry, as you said, when you see someone doing the wrong thing, and recognize that actually you have the moral high ground and not necessarily smug. That is a good way of saying it, but also that you understand there are other things going on.
I mean, but that's a really interesting thought, and it does sort of fly against some of the things that we are used to seeing and reading these days. So actually, to consciously think, I am better than you, I have a better moral standing right now. As you say, they will change, hopefully. We don't know what stresses there are in their life, but right now I can look at that person with their feet on the seats on the train, and I can either ask them not to, as I have done many times, and sometimes it ends well, other times less so. But you're saying to consciously think, I am a better person than that individual is right now. That can be helpful to my stress management. Yeah,
but I think in those situations, and I'm sure many of us have been there, where you want to intervene and tell somebody, look, it's pretty selfish to be putting your feet on the train, particularly if someone else is trying to have a seat or wants to sit there after you've left your dirty feet on there. But sometimes the situation might be escalatory in nature, that you think, I better not, because this person doesn't look stable, or they're drunk, or they might be on drugs, and it could cause more risk and danger for others around. So there is always going to be a balance, but it's something that you have as an individual just to make that judgment call.
Okay. Now, when we're thinking about community, it's very easy to blame ourselves for, in our minds, not doing enough to help, the way we put pressure on ourselves. Now, you say this is like there are two injuries being caused here. One caused, as you described, by the arrow of the actual experience, for example, witnessing the war in Ukraine, as we all are. The second, inflicted by the arrow we unwittingly shoot ourselves through self-criticism or doubt, i.e. thinking to ourselves, I should be doing more, I should be contributing more, etc., etc. How do we avoid that second arrow?
It's a great question. It can be very small things that help us not feel like that. And you can see, particularly in the case of Ukraine, whether it was Homes for Ukraine, where people were just doing their bit, they might have helped one family or one individual from a family find safety in the UK for a period of time. Many I know are still here. Those really matter. Those acts of kindness and compassion to others can make a real difference. You see all the charities where people are driving back and forth, delivering goods and supplies and stuff. Those things, I think, for many people, make them feel like they are contributing, because they genuinely are. So it doesn't take huge demonstrative acts of, not necessarily kindness, but big acts to make a difference, and to be able to give yourself permission to recognise that that is enough. What we're doing for many people, it is all you can do, and therefore recognising what is enough is key. I struggle with this. I'm sure you do as well. Like, you always feel like you should and could be doing more. But I know what you're doing in telling these stories is hugely valuable for your 100,000+ listeners a day, to feel part of a community where we're collectively providing support indirectly or directly to a nation that absolutely has the moral high ground, and as hideous as it is that they have the things they have to endure daily, they should take comfort in knowing that they are on the right side of history.
Now, you're talking about social isolation, and a lot of people who very generously give their time to listen to this podcast we're spread out all around the world. Some people are on their, or feel like they're on their own geographically, and they might be thousands of miles away from anyone else, and they feel swamped by the news, they feel swamped by online criticism, most of which are bots.
Yeah.
But they feel cut off, their values are challenged, so it's very easy to feel angry and scared and alone. You say in the book there's a formidable body of research that demonstrates just how damaging social isolation can be for the immune system and cognitive decline, and how maintaining social bonds can protect us. And yet geographic isolation doesn't have to mean social isolation, especially these days online. But tell me about your trip to Nepal when you were working with the Gurkha Welfare Trust, doing some projects out there, about an elderly lady who appeared out of the pre-dawn darkness to bring you some warm, sweet milk. This is an extraordinary story.
Yeah, so I try and end the book with some really positive, uplifting tales, as it were, in the community chapter, the power of community and kindness. And this was an experience that just reinforced that those with the least often give the most. And I travelled as part of my work with the Gurkhas, who I was a soldier with, and we were going around, as you said, Gurkha Welfare Trust, looking at various projects. And we had been to a village the day before to look at a school that was being built for them, the first school they'd had. And I was very self-conscious about being treated like I paid for it myself, and I obviously hadn't. So we set up camp outside the village to carry on our trek the next day to the next village to look at a bridge or water well or something. And they knew that we were leaving early, and as we were packing up our tents, still pitch black, 6 o'clock in the morning, and this little lantern or this light appeared coming up the path, and when it got closer, saw this elderly lady who looked about 80. She may well have been younger than that, but she was pretty frail. And she had an urn of hot goat's milk, and we hadn't met her the previous day, but she said she'd heard about us, and she wanted to make sure that we left with something warm in our bellies. And so I started chatting to her in Nepali and asking her how many goats she had and where she lived, and turns out she didn't have any goats herself. It was her friend's goats, first sort of fact. And then she had to go to her friend's house, therefore, rather than her house, which was about an hour's walk out the village, the other side. So she'd got up, I guess, about 3 a.m. or earlier, perhaps, walked an hour to her friend's house, milked her friend's goats, walked back to her house to heat the milk, and then walked another hour or whatever it was to us, just to say, go on your way with something warm. Which was incredibly humbling and just epitomised that entire country of really generous, kind people. And it just, I don't do it as much as I should. I'm sure we all don't. You experience these things, think, I must be kinder, I must do more. And you quite quickly get back into your daily life. But it just reinforces that you don't have to have anything to necessarily make a huge difference to someone else. And that's a good lesson for us all, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that was a lovely story about kindness, but it's also culture. I mean, that's...
Yeah. It's a collective culture of you support everyone in your village. Your self is kind of the last thing that matters. It's family, community, and then self. And that's a really powerful thing, I think, for all of us, again, to recognise. And there are many cultures in the world, probably generally these days, those that are less developed. The more Western countries with more things and more material in their outlook, and it's all about getting the latest iPhone and this and that. For them, it's making sure that everyone has a meal or everyone has a warm roof and everyone's getting an education and that sort of stuff. And you will always help each other to collectively survive and thrive.
But one of the lessons I took from the book was, you mentioned there, family, community, self. It seems that if you concentrate on family and community, the self
takes care of itself,
looks after itself. Yeah, is enriched by the process.
Now, that's not to say that when you are on your own and, as you said, feeling isolated geographically or otherwise, it is tough. And for me, in some of my most challenging moments, particularly on the personal side, trying to be a parent, etc., that it wasn't necessarily those who were closest to me geographically or even in friendship terms that were there for me. And I've had more experiences more recently where I've even had clients at work who I've learned have gone through some horrendous trauma, and being able to connect and making the effort to connect with people, even if you're not that close to them, just reaching out to make sure they're okay, can make the world of a difference to them. I mean, literally life-changing difference, particularly where the closest friends and family are too close to the problem and don't know what to say. And the number of people I've met who said, everyone who I thought would be there just are avoiding us because they don't know what to say. But by not saying anything, they kind of make it not necessarily worse, but they certainly don't make it better. So I try and live by the mantra now of, if in doubt, reach out. If you don't hear from somebody for a while, just check in. It doesn't cost anything, and that doesn't stop you anywhere in the world doing that, given that we're all so connected now. So finding a community, whatever it may be, is very powerful. And your community of listeners now is a community, so people should not feel isolated or alone. There is a community built around you and these stories that you're telling that is powerful in itself.
Yeah, I got into a Twitter spat recently with
a bot?
someone, probably with a bot. I know
Well, you must be doing something right if you're getting botted.
Well, exactly. I ignore most. I play with a few, but I do react to a couple every now and again. But yeah, so somebody
compassion. Come on.
That I hadn't exactly. So I did feel like I had the moral high ground, but it was against the computer. So, but a friend I hadn't spoken to for ages did reach out with just two words. Just messaged me, DM me, and said, "All right, knobber."
Oh, yeah.
So
they go back to humour.
Perfect.
A bit of abuse just can diffuse things, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, on community, you say, the book says, we have a tendency to assume that when we are struggling, our struggles are unique, cultivated out of unique us-shaped circumstances and influences. The truth is that we share so much of a species insofar as what we are affected by and how we react. A practical technique we can use when we're feeling very entwined in our own existence and isolated from everyone else is to select a person with one trait or possession, a behaviour or thought similar to one of our own, and for a brief second just say to oneself, just like me. The just like me technique, you say, has been developed by psychologist Jack Caulfield. So have you used this, and who did you pick when you were thinking, just like me?
Yeah, this is part of Jess's piece in the book, so I have her to thank for highlighting this as a technique. I do it all the time. I mean, the number of people that I speak to around the world in different fora who have similar experiences. It may be, we've all gone through a relationship breakdown. I challenge anybody to say they never have. I mean, maybe there's a few. We all suffer from self-doubt at some point in our lives, unless we are the biggest narcissists in the world. Perception of failure or fear of failure, all these kind of things, they are normal feelings to have, and therefore, generally, there will always have been someone else who's gone through this. You are not the first person to have gone through it. So clearly that doesn't necessarily help if they're many generations apart or it's only a famous person or whatever. But even within your friend group, I mean, some of the stories that I've told about childhood, about relationships, about parenting in this book, and those who've had advanced copies, the number of people, I've honestly lost count now, who've then shared something back and said not that they necessarily felt on their own, but they wanted to share that they have had a similar experience, whether it's an abusive parent or a pretty traumatic breakup or a challenging parenting situation. So if that helps anybody just by being able to voice their experience, and they may be saying, like me, or they are. I mean, the fact that they're reaching out to me and saying, yeah, I can relate to this. And I said, I've had so many messages, voice notes and others from people saying, God, I didn't realise either you were going through this at the time when I knew you back then, or I've had something very similar. So that's quite powerful in itself. And they've said they felt a little bit of a weight has been lifted by being able to, me giving them permission in some ways, not, obviously directly, but they feel like they now have permission to talk about some of these things because I have. And that's hopefully going to be the case for many people who read the book.
Yeah. Which takes us on to your, I'd like to talk about the charity work that you do, but also the power of a charitable either donation or work. We speak to a lot of people who drive vehicles to Ukraine or in other way help with other humanitarian supplies. We also speak to people who serve in the International Legion and elsewhere. But the power of charity in terms of helping the individual as well as the wider community. In the charity work you've done, were you surprised at how much, speaking selfishly for a moment, how good it was for you to get involved in this? And is that a bad thing? Are we bad people for thinking that?
Not at all. I mean, for me, this is all about values. Personal, whether you're at work or supporting a charity, it's the values piece of our lives, the why. Why do we do something? Why does it matter and why is it important? In my business life, we talk about this as common purpose. It's finding things that bind you together and working with people who have shared values that overlap with your own, whether it's organisationally or personally, is really, really important. So finding charities that align with your values that you can support in any way feels good. And I don't see it as a selfish thing to enjoy feeling like I'm making a difference with those charities. And I recognise that I'm just one very small part in a much bigger community and an enterprise. But I wouldn't have written this book if it wasn't for others. I am a reluctant accidental author. And the only reason I'm willing to promote it and push it is because I want it to help people directly reading the book, but also indirectly because I'm donating 100% of all author profits, assuming there'll be some. Let's hope there'll be lots. Please go and buy it. But I'm donating every penny of profit to a couple of charities, the Royal British Veterans Enterprise, which does amazing work for veterans in all sorts of ways, and the Gurkha Welfare Trust. And I hope also to work with many other charities in the coming years who are also doing amazing work, whether it's the Not Forgotten, Combat Stress, and many international charities as well that I'm linked to, because every little effort counts. counts. In it, cumulatively, again, across that community can make the power of difference.
Yeah, the Not Forgotten were one of the Telegraph's 4 Christmas charities. Christmas just gone.
Yeah.
You'll still be able to, if you so wish, still be able to make any donation there. You can have a look on our community pages on our website to have a look at the Not Forgotten. I'd not heard of the Royal British Veterans Enterprise.
They've just had a rebrand fairly recently. It used to be known as the Royal British Legion Industries, but because of confusion and because of the work they're doing, they're now looking to the next phase of their growth journey, because the enterprise word is key, because they run a for-profit business that makes road signs, so on the motorways around the UK, and train, not that you're probably looking at the front of a train, or maybe if you have any drivers listening, but they make signs as a for-profit business that's run by veterans. And the beautiful thing about that is that veterans who want to get back into work, who may be coming through something challenging, if you went to try and apply for a regular job in Civvy Street, as it were, they would require you to do your 40 hours a week or what have you. This is a way of enabling veterans to start getting back into a community, into a team, and they will start, if you can manage 2 hours a week, that's a start just to get people back in. So the enterprise piece of what RBVE does is really important and very powerful for that community.
Okay, we'll link to that in the episode notes.
Thank you.
Now, the last topic, I want to talk about moral injury, and I want to dial back into the present situation, not only specifically with regard to Ukraine, but also the wider global situation right now. So first of all, let's define what we're talking about, or have a stab at it. Moral injury, talking about where we suffer by means of association with the decision-making or behaviour of others with which we do not agree or personally find immoral. Now, when we look at this disgusting assault on Ukraine and Putin's casual disregard for human life, plus some of the decisions by our Western leaders, I wonder if the frustration and anger I feel is this moral injury.
Yeah.
I don't see a way through it other than just to try and put it in context. Normally with an injury you can treat it.
Yeah.
But can you treat moral injury?
Yeah, it's whether you can treat the cause is arguably questionable unless you are in positions of authority. But as you are with a powerful voice here and others like you, and those that are trying to do the right thing by Ukraine, which I fully support, there are ways to try and ameliorate the risks or the consequences or implications of moral injury. But I think it's also really important to recognise that because we do not own all the levers here, and many of us have no influence really that's going to change the thinking of some Western leaders that have questionable views on this without really thinking long term about the consequences, not just in that immediate Ukraine region, but far beyond, that we also have to find ways to not disassociate, but to try and detach ourselves a little bit from that. If it's causing you so much trauma to feel like you're helpless and you're not able to influence, then we have to also learn a bit, like training a muscle, just to accept that we don't own all the levers, and therefore do what you can and influence the things you can influence, and try to just detach yourself from the things that are just going to wind you up or cause you more stress and trauma that might prevent you from doing the little things that could be positive, because you're so overwhelmed by the volume and the nature of the news and the current affairs that are so, in some cases, outrageous.
Yeah, and that's when the community comes in, and all the bits
100%.
we've been talking about leaning on your friends, reaching out, etc. Ash, thank you so much for your time. Best of luck with the book. We'll put a link to it's out on the 22nd.
22nd in the UK and globally on the 27th.
Brilliant.
So it'll be available in all good bookshops and all other bookshops as well.
So you've not been idle as you were once described.
I
you were
still
lying
feel
down.
slightly idle. I always compare to how others are being less idle than me. So yeah.
Any plans for another marathon, or are you checking into a hotel just to
I'll continue running slowly for charities if it helps raise awareness and raise money, but don't expect any World Championship times.
Ash Alexander-Cooper, thanks so much for talking to Ukraine the latest.
Thanks, Dom. Appreciate it.
But let's go then to our final thoughts now. So I just wanted to say that it's very easy amid everything going on at the moment to be downhearted and to look away, but you at home never let us down. I just wanted to thank everybody who's written to us, whether via the inbox, in letters, postcards, DMs on X, since this year started. We do not take them for granted. We just don't have the capacity to reply to everybody, which is infinitely frustrating, and we hope to rectify that over the coming months. But if you're listening to this and you're Felix in Hamburg, Henning in Berlin, Ian in Edinburgh, Phil in Australia, and Bo in the US, we answer your questions in the newsletter today, so don't miss that. And I wanted to give a special shout out to Louisa, who sent us each personalised notebooks, and to anybody who wrote in over Christmas to talk about your humanitarian work in Ukraine. Matt Cooper, for instance, delivered 50 ballistic vests and helmets for children, Christmas presents for soldiers, and 5 4x4 vehicles after hearing a segment we did on the organisation Ukrainian Action. While more often these acts don't make the headlines around the world that they did, they remain, of course, as important as ever, and we will continue to draw attention to them over the coming weeks. But as I say, just a quick note to say thank you all very, very much. We do, as we always say, read every message. But Dom, where do you want to leave listeners today?
Well, thanks, Francis. I've been asked my thoughts on Donald Trump's ridiculous comment last night on Fox News about NATO soldiers in Afghanistan. Now, just as a reminder, if you didn't have the delight of catching it, he said, "They'll say they sent some troops to Afghanistan, and they did. They stayed a little back, a little off the front lines." As I said at the start, 457 British soldiers were killed in Afghanistan, and Denmark lost the most soldiers per capita. Now, as a veteran, British veteran, I don't feel insulted by Donald Trump's comments. I just shake my head at the gross stupidity of this man who seemingly never misses an opportunity to display his immense ignorance when it comes to the profession of arms. When I saw his comment, I laughed, as it's the kind of stupid, thoughtless, undignified and dishonourable statement that could only come from somebody who would not only never go near a front line, but who will never understand and doesn't think it important to try to understand the character and motivations of men and women in this world who are prepared to endure hardship and discomfort and to risk everything for something bigger than themselves. Trump's comment is irrelevant to me, but I feel for the men and women in uniformed service in the United States for whom this man is the commander-in-chief, the man who can choose whether or not to put them in harm's way. Now, I know they would go willingly, if so ordered. But the idea that this man may, through his flabby and casual ignorance, the offhand and thoughtless way he plays soldiers, be responsible for the premature death of a child's mum or dad, a husband or wife, just leaves me sad. And it leaves me grateful that he was never in my chain of command. Would he care if his choice led to a child growing up without their parent? This is a man who, last April, chose to go to a golf weekend rather than attend the repatriation of 4 US soldiers who were killed in Lithuania. So if anyone is a little bit back, I would say it is Donald Trump, who is a little bit back from where the men and women wearing US uniform deserve their commander-in-chief to be. Hail to the chief.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow the Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.